Marble columns, golden palaces, triumphant legions marching through the streets of Rome. This is how we remember the Roman Empire: grand, glorious, civilized. But behind those marble facades, in the shadows of those golden halls, existed a reality that history has largely chosen to forget. Young men, stripped of their freedom, their dignity, their very identity, forced into lives of servitude that went far beyond ordinary slavery. They weren't just servants sweeping floors or tending gardens. They were human beings trapped in a system designed to exploit their youth, their vulnerability, and their complete powerlessness for the pleasure of Rome's elite. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on one of ancient Rome's most uncomfortable truths: the systematic exploitation of male concubines, young men who lived and died in circumstances that reveal the brutal cost of Roman civilization's grandeur.
Like, subscribe, and let's learn how these young men lived as Roman concubines.
The selection. To understand the horror, we must first understand the process. In the slave markets of Rome, wealthy patricians moved with the same calculated precision as modern buyers at a livestock auction. They examined potential purchases for physical attributes, age, and origin. The young men standing before them, some barely teenagers, were not people to be considered, but commodities to be evaluated. The markets themselves were carefully organized affairs. The Forum Boarium, near the Tiber River, hosted some of Rome's largest slave auctions. Here, beneath marble porticos, human lives were bought and sold like grain or pottery. Auctioneers called out prices while potential buyers circled their prey, examining teeth, testing muscle tone, checking for scars or deformities that might reduce value. The buyers showed particular preference for certain origins. Greeks were prized for their supposed refinement and education. A young man who could recite Homer or discuss philosophy commanded premium prices. Germanic captives were valued for their fair complexion and robust build, their blonde hair and blue eyes exotic treasures in Mediterranean society. Gauls were sought for their height and strength, while Thracians were prized for their reported stamina and loyalty. Age was crucial. Boys between 12 and 18 were most valuable, old enough to serve, young enough to be molded. Virginity, when it could be verified, added significantly to the price. Some traders specialized in this market, maintaining training houses where captured boys were prepared for sale, taught basic Latin phrases, grooming techniques, and the rudimentary skills expected of a pleasure companion. The selection process was deliberately dehumanizing. Young men were made to stand exposed while strangers debated their worth, examined their teeth like horses, tested their limbs for strength and flexibility. Buyers would force them to walk, to turn, to demonstrate their physical attributes. Some were made to sing or recite poetry to prove their vocal abilities. Others were examined for specific physical characteristics their future masters might desire. The terror these boys must have felt, torn from their families, unable to speak the language, understanding only that their lives were being bartered away, is almost impossible to imagine. Many had been captured in raids on their villages, others sold into slavery by desperate families facing starvation. Some were prisoners of war, their homelands conquered by Roman legions. Prices varied dramatically. A common agricultural slave might sell for 500 denarii, roughly 2 years' wages for a laborer, but an attractive young man destined for a life of intimate servitude could command 2,000 to 5,000 denarii, sometimes more. The most expensive recorded sale involved a Greek youth who reportedly cost his buyer 10,000 denarii, enough to purchase a modest villa. But the market was only the beginning. Once purchased, these young men entered a world that would systematically strip away everything that made them human. The system of control. Roman households were not just homes. They were complex social hierarchies where every person's value was measured by their usefulness to the master. And at the bottom of this hierarchy, occupying a position that was somehow both privileged and utterly degraded, were the male concubines. The hierarchy was rigid and merciless. At the top stood the paterfamilias, the male head of household who held absolute power over every person within his domain. Below him were his wife and children, then free dependents and clients, followed by skilled slaves, household slaves, and finally, at the very bottom, the concubines, valuable property with no rights, no protection, and no hope of appeal. Their lives were no longer their own. They were expected to be available at all hours, to anticipate their master's needs before being asked, to maintain an appearance of willing participation regardless of their true feelings. The psychological toll of this existence cannot be overstated. Training began immediately upon arrival. New concubines were assigned to experienced household slaves who taught them the master's preferences, his daily routines, his moods and triggers. They learned which wines he preferred, how he liked his bath prepared, what topics of conversation pleased or angered him. This wasn't education, it was conditioning, designed to transform free-thinking human beings into responsive instruments of pleasure. The concept of personal time simply didn't exist. A concubine might be summoned from sleep in the middle of the night, called from meals before they could finish eating, interrupted from any task to attend their master's whims. This constant availability was enforced through a system of bells, servants, and ever-present supervision. Imagine being forced to smile while enduring treatment that violated every aspect of your dignity. Imagine having to appear grateful for privileges that came at the cost of your autonomy. Imagine living in constant fear, not just of punishment, but of the next summons, the next demand, the next violation of your person. Some concubines lived in luxurious quarters, private rooms decorated with frescoes, furnished with comfortable beds, supplied with fine clothing and jewelry. But these privileges were chains, not gifts. Every comfort came with the understanding that it could be withdrawn at any moment. Every kindness was conditional on compliance. The rooms themselves were designed for control. Windows, if they existed, were barred or placed too high to see the street. Doors often locked from the outside. Personal possessions were forbidden. Everything belonged to the master, including the clothes on their backs. Some quarters had hidden peepholes, allowing masters or their agents to observe their property even in supposed privacy. Others lived in conditions barely better than common slaves. Cramped spaces shared with multiple occupants, thin mattresses on stone floors, minimal clothing, basic food. These concubines were called upon only when their master desired their company, then dismissed back to quarters where they had no privacy, no possessions, and no hope. The contrast between these two treatment styles was often deliberate. Masters used the threat of demotion to worse quarters as a tool of control, while the promise of better conditions encouraged compliance among those still living in squalor. The daily reality. The day-to-day existence of a Roman male concubine varied depending on their master's whims and social status, but certain elements remained constant: uncertainty, powerlessness, and the complete absence of autonomy. A typical day began before dawn. Concubines were expected to be awake, groomed, and ready before their master stirred. The morning routine was elaborate and ritualized, preparing the master's bath, selecting appropriate clothing, arranging his jewelry and perfumes. Every detail had to be perfect, because imperfection meant punishment. Morning might bring summons to the master's chambers for private audiences that could last minutes or hours. Afternoon could mean accompanying him to the public baths, where concubines stood silent while their master conducted business, expected to be ornamental and available. At the baths, they served as living advertisements of their master's wealth and taste, their beauty and comportment reflecting directly on his status. Evening might involve entertaining guests at elaborate dinner parties. Concubines were expected to serve wine, offer food, engage in conversation when spoken to, and provide entertainment through music, poetry, or dance. They moved through these gatherings like beautiful ghosts, present but not truly there, available but not acknowledged as human. The banquet hall was perhaps the most complex social environment concubines had to navigate. They needed to read the room, understanding which guests required deferential treatment, which conversations to encourage, which topics to avoid. A misstep could embarrass their master publicly, resulting in severe punishment later. Physical appearance was maintained through strict regimens they had no choice but to follow. Morning exercises in private courtyards, often overseen by trainers who had once been gladiators or dancers. Specific diets that emphasized foods believed to enhance beauty and stamina while avoiding anything that might cause weight gain or blemishes. Grooming practices consumed hours each day. Hair had to be washed, oiled, and styled according to current fashion. Skin was treated with various oils, pumice stones for smoothness, and cosmetics to enhance natural features. Teeth were cleaned with mixtures of ground pumice and honey. Nails were trimmed and polished. Body hair was removed through painful plucking or primitive waxing techniques. Some underwent cosmetic treatments or even surgeries to alter their appearance according to their master's preferences. These procedures were performed without modern medical knowledge or pain management, making them both dangerous and excruciating. Nose reshaping, skin lightening treatments, even attempts to change eye color through dangerous substances, all in service of an idealized beauty that existed only in their master's imagination. The clothing and jewelry they wore served as both ornament and symbol of ownership. Masters took pride in how beautifully they could dress their companions, treating them like living dolls rather than human beings. Silk tunics from distant China, gold jewelry crafted by master artisans, precious stones that cost more than most Romans earned in a lifetime. The irony was stark, draped in silk and gold, yet utterly powerless beneath these beautiful trappings. Different occasions demanded different appearances. Formal dinner parties required one type of clothing, private audiences another, public appearances yet another. Concubines had to memorize these expectations and execute them flawlessly, becoming human chameleons who could transform themselves to match any situation. Travel was another aspect that might seem privileged, but was actually another form of control. Some concubines accompanied their masters on journeys to other cities or provinces, but this travel was never voluntary. They were portable property, expected to provide the same services regardless of location while adapting to new environments without complaint. Traveling meant additional challenges, unfamiliar customs, different languages, new social dynamics to navigate. A concubine might find himself in a Gallic villa one week and an Egyptian palace the next, always expected to adapt instantly while maintaining the same level of service. The psychological manipulation. Perhaps even more damaging than the physical aspects of their servitude was the systematic psychological manipulation these young men endured. Roman masters, and the system that supported them, had refined techniques for breaking down resistance and creating dependency. Some concubines were given special privileges, access to books, better food, private chambers, only to have these gifts withdrawn as punishment for perceived slights. This created a constant state of anxiety and confusion, never knowing whether they were in favor or facing punishment. Isolation was another weapon. Masters deliberately prevented their concubines from forming friendships or alliances with other household members. This was particularly cruel for young men who had been torn from their families and communities, as it prevented them from maintaining any connection to their former identities. When masters kept multiple concubines, they often pitted them against each other for attention and privileges. This prevented solidarity among the victims and created an atmosphere of constant tension and betrayal. Young men who might have found comfort in shared experiences instead found themselves competing for their master's favor. Even education, when provided, was weaponized. Concubines were taught to read, write, and engage in philosophical discussions, but only in ways that pleased their masters. Their learning was another tool used to shape them into more perfect objects for their owner's enjoyment. The legal void. What made their situation particularly tragic was the complete absence of legal protection. While Roman law provided some rights for citizens, and even certain protections for ordinary slaves, male concubines occupied a gray area where their master's desires took precedence over any consideration of their well-being. They couldn't seek help from authorities. They couldn't form meaningful relationships. They couldn't even express their suffering without risking severe punishment. The law saw them as property, not persons, making their abuse legally invisible. This legal invisibility extended to their families. Parents who had lost sons to slavery often never learned what had become of them. The separation was complete, not just physical, but legal and social. These young men were erased from their former lives as thoroughly as if they had died. The economics of exploitation. The system persisted because it was profitable. Wealthy Romans competed with each other to acquire the most beautiful or talented companions, driving up prices and creating incentives for traders to continue supplying this market. The commodification of human beings reached its peak in these transactions. Young men's lives were reduced to simple monetary calculations. Age, appearance, skills, and origin all factored into their price, like features on a piece of merchandise. Training schools existed specifically to prepare young men for these roles, much like gladiator schools prepared fighters for the arena. These institutions were as brutal as they were profitable, systematically breaking down personalities and resistance while teaching the skills expected by future masters. The curriculum included not just physical training, but psychological conditioning designed to create compliant, attractive companions. Young men were taught to anticipate needs, to read moods, to perform contentment while suppressing their true emotions. Resistance and survival. Despite the systematic oppression, some concubines found ways to resist or survive with their humanity intact. These acts of defiance, while often subtle and dangerous, reveal the indomitable nature of the human spirit even under the most crushing circumstances. The few records that exist of escape attempts paint a picture of desperate young men willing to risk everything for the slimmest chance of freedom. Escape required careful planning, intimate knowledge of the household's routines, and often the cooperation of sympathetic slaves or servants. Some attempts involved stealing their master's seal to forge travel documents. Others relied on connections with merchants or traders, who might provide passage to distant provinces. One documented case from Pompeii tells of a concubine named Alexios who attempted to flee during a religious festival when household security was relaxed. He made it as far as the harbor before being recaptured, sold to a gladiator school as punishment. His story, preserved in graffiti found in the training facility, serves as a reminder of both the desperation and courage of these forgotten young men. The punishments for failed escape attempts were severe and public, designed to discourage others from making similar attempts. These punishments often involved not just physical pain, but public humiliation, as masters wanted to demonstrate their complete control over their property. Flogging was common, but more creative punishments included branding, forced labor in mines or quarries, or sale to establishments where conditions were known to be even worse. Some masters employed professional slave catchers, skilled trackers who specialized in hunting down runaway property. These men knew the common escape routes, the places where fugitives might seek shelter, the underground networks that sometimes helped slaves flee. Their success rate was disturbingly high, and their methods were often brutal. Suicide represented another form of escape, and some concubines tried to end their suffering through self-harm. But even this final escape was often denied. Masters who had invested significant sums took measures to prevent this loss of property, including constant supervision, removal of sharp objects, and even the use of restraints during periods of particular despair. Yet even in these desperate circumstances, the human spirit found ways to endure. Concubines developed subtle networks of communication and support, sharing information and comfort through coded gestures and whispered conversations. They created their own languages, combinations of hand signals, facial expressions, and seemingly innocent phrases that allowed them to communicate warnings, share news, or simply acknowledge each other's humanity. These networks were necessarily secretive and constantly changing. Discovery meant severe punishment for all involved, but they provided crucial emotional support in an otherwise isolating existence, proving that even under the most oppressive conditions, humans will find ways to connect with one another. Some concubines became expert at reading their master's moods and manipulating household dynamics to their advantage. They learned to identify which servants could be trusted, which family members might show mercy, which visitors might be sympathetic to their plight. This emotional intelligence became a survival skill, helping them navigate the treacherous waters of Roman household politics. Religion provided another form of resistance, though it had to be practiced in secret. Some concubines found solace in mystery religions, like the cult of Mithras, or early Christianity, faiths that offered hope of salvation and dignity regardless of social status. Secret prayers, hidden symbols, clandestine gatherings, these small acts of spiritual defiance helped maintain their sense of humanity. Physical resistance, while dangerous, did occur. Records exist of concubines who struck back against particularly cruel masters, though such actions almost always resulted in death or sale to even worse conditions. These acts of violent resistance were rare, but they demonstrate that the human capacity for self-defense could not be completely extinguished. The broader impact. The social acceptance of this system among Roman elites reveals much about the moral framework of ancient Rome. While Romans prided themselves on concepts of honor, duty, and virtue, these ideals apparently only applied to free citizens of appropriate social status. The normalization of treating human beings as objects for pleasure contributed to a broader culture of exploitation. This cultural acceptance made it easier for Romans to justify other forms of cruelty, from gladiatorial games to the brutal suppression of slave revolts. The impact extended beyond Rome's borders. The demand for young men created trade networks that stretched across the Mediterranean and beyond, affecting entire communities and cultures. Warfare, kidnapping, and debt slavery all fed this system, creating ripple effects of suffering that reached far beyond the immediate victims. The forgotten voices. Archaeological evidence provides glimpses into these forgotten lives, though much remains hidden beneath layers of time and deliberate concealment. Artifacts found in wealthy Roman households include objects that tell subtle stories of control and resistance. In Herculaneum, archaeologists discovered a villa containing what appeared to be specially designed quarters for concubines. Small rooms with reinforced doors, barred windows, and hidden compartments where personal items might be secretly stored. The walls bore faint scratches that could have been primitive calendars, ways of marking time in lives where days blended into an endless cycle of servitude. One particularly moving discovery came from a villa near Pompeii, where excavators found a small bronze mirror engraved with Greek letters spelling out eleutheria, freedom. Hidden beneath a loose floorstone, it may have belonged to a concubine who kept this single word as a reminder of what he had lost and hoped to regain. Literary references in Roman writings are often brief and euphemistic, reflecting authors' desire to acknowledge these relationships without describing their disturbing aspects. Pliny the Younger, in his letters, mentions giving a handsome young Greek as a gift to a friend, treating the transaction as casually as he might discuss lending a book. Seneca, despite his philosophical writings on virtue and dignity, owned several young male companions and wrote about their duties with disturbing casualness. But between the lines of these texts, we can read the reality of lives characterized by powerlessness and exploitation. When Petronius describes a wealthy freedman's household in his Satyricon, his satirical portrait reveals the casual cruelty with which such relationships were conducted. The humor was built on shared assumptions about what these young men endured. Legal documents provide another window into their world. Wills and inventories sometimes list concubines alongside furniture and livestock, assigned monetary values for inheritance purposes. Marriage contracts occasionally included clauses about the husband's existing household arrangements, euphemistic language that acknowledged the continued presence of male companions even after marriage. The few concubines who managed to gain freedom and achieve some measure of success in later life stand out precisely because they were so exceptional. These individuals often had to completely reinvent themselves, hiding their past while struggling to overcome the psychological damage of their earlier experiences. One such case involved a former concubine named Marcus Antonius Lysander, whose tombstone near Rome proudly declares his later success as a merchant and citizen. But the inscription's careful wording, "who rose from humble beginnings to honor," suggests a deliberate obscuring of his true origins. The very need for such concealment speaks to the lasting stigma these men carried. Lessons from the past. We must remember that behind every historical statistic was a real human being with hopes, fears, and dreams that were never allowed to flourish. The concubines of ancient Rome were not footnotes to history, but individuals whose experiences reveal important truths about power, exploitation, and human resilience. Their stories challenge us to look beyond the marble facades and golden treasures of ancient Rome to see the human cost of this civilization's grandeur. They remind us that historical progress often came at the expense of the most vulnerable members of society. The systematic nature of this exploitation demonstrates how easily societies can normalize cruelty when it serves the interests of the powerful. The Romans' ability to maintain elaborate philosophical and legal systems while operating this network of human trafficking shows how selective moral reasoning can become. The horrific reality of male concubines in the Roman Empire serves as a stark reminder that civilization's greatest achievements often rest on foundations of unspeakable cruelty. The marble columns and golden palaces were built, in part, on the suffering of young men whose names we'll never know, whose voices were silenced, whose humanity was denied. These young men lived and died in circumstances that no human being should ever endure. Their stories deserve to be remembered not as historical curiosities, but as testimonies to both human suffering and resilience. The past cannot be changed, but by remembering these forgotten voices, we can work to ensure that such stories never repeat themselves in our own time. If this exploration of hidden Roman history resonated with you, subscribe for more stories that challenge our understanding of the past.